The courtroom was silent, except for the rustling of papers and the soft shuffle of shoes across the polished floors. Clint Eastwood, a man synonymous with tough guys, westerns, and gripping action, sat at the defendant's table. His face, usually as unshakable as the statues in his films, betrayed nothing but a faint tension, barely noticeable, but enough to hint at the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The judge's voice echoed in the room. "Mr. Eastwood, you are accused of fraud. How do you plead?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The courtroom was packed with reporters, camera crews, and a small sea of spectators, all waiting for Clint to answer. The accusation was absurd, ridiculous, even. A man like Clint Eastwood, someone who had played heroes, soldiers, and lawmen for decades, was now standing trial for something as sinister as fraud? "Not guilty, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that reverberated through the room. The words hung in the air, and for a split second, Clint's mind flashed to his Hollywood days, the countless hours spent perfecting roles, creating a persona that was as invincible as any of the characters he portrayed. But this was different. This was real life. The prosecutor, a young man with an air of confidence that could rival any seasoned courtroom veteran, stood up, adjusting his glasses. He was ready for this moment, the moment when the great Clint Eastwood would be brought down to earth, when the hero of Hollywood would reveal his true nature. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the people will prove that Clint Eastwood is not the man he claims to be. He is a fraud, a liar who has deceived not just Hollywood, but all of America. Behind the scenes, he's been involved in a web of deceit and manipulation, pulling the strings of powerful people to further his own agenda. This trial is only the beginning of unraveling the truth." Clint's mind raced. Fraud? Manipulation? None of this made sense. He had been the icon of justice, of integrity. But now, here he was, fighting for his very name and reputation. He had played tough guys for years, but now, he had to play the role of a man who had been wrongly accused. The audience's murmurs grew louder. The idea of Clint Eastwood, a man who had once stood tall in the most iconic westerns and action films, being accused of something so despicable was nearly too much to bear. But there was more to this than just a courtroom drama. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a famous actor. He was more than that, far more. And deep down, he knew the truth. This was no ordinary fraud case. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Clint walked out of the courtroom, his mind still reeling from the accusations. His attorney, a seasoned legal eagle named Jack Rivers, was talking to the press, giving a calm, controlled statement. Clint barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, on the man who had orchestrated this entire fiasco. The media had jumped on the case like vultures, hungry for the next big scandal. Headlines flashed across the screens. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood, fraud or hero? Did Clint Eastwood fake his legacy? The dark side of Clint Eastwood, what they don't want you to know. The scrutiny was unbearable, but Clint knew something bigger was at play. There was no way a simple fraud case could bring his name into the headlines like this. The charges were too specific, too calculated. Someone had orchestrated this, and Clint had an idea of who it might be. As he made his way to the car, Clint's thoughts turned to a time long ago, back when he wasn't just a Hollywood star, but a man working for a different kind of justice. His time with the CIA. It had been years since Clint Eastwood left the world of covert operations, but the skills he had learned, skills that went beyond acting, never left him. A lifetime spent in the shadows, dealing with secrets, lies, and betrayal. In that world, Clint was more than just an actor. He was a man who had lived and breathed espionage, a man who had played a part in some of the CIA's most covert missions. He couldn't help but wonder if his past had finally caught up with him. That night, Clint couldn't sleep. His mind kept running back to the case, to the accusations, and to the question that kept gnawing at him. Why now? Then, a memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. It was from a mission back in the early 80s, a mission so secret that even now, he wasn't allowed to talk about it. He had been part of a special CIA task force tasked with infiltrating foreign intelligence agencies. It was dangerous, high-stakes work, and Clint had been the perfect person for the job. His training in deception and manipulation made him an invaluable asset. But during one of those missions, something had gone horribly wrong. Clint had discovered something so shocking that it had shaken him to his core. A betrayal at the highest level, an operation that had been orchestrated by someone within the CIA itself. Clint had never spoken about it. The mission had been classified, and anyone who knew about it had been silenced, one way or another. But now, as Clint looked at the accusations in the press, he wondered if someone from his past was trying to take him down. Someone with a lot of power and a long memory. Clint was no fool. He knew the world of espionage wasn't just about secrets. It was about leverage. And someone had leverage over him. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Just as Clint was beginning to connect the dots, his doorbell rang in the middle of the night. He hesitated. He didn't know who it could be. He hadn't told anyone where he was staying, but he wasn't surprised when the visitor revealed herself to be someone from his past. Emma Hayes, Clint's former CIA colleague, and someone he thought he'd never see again. "Clint," Emma said, her voice low, "we need to talk." Clint opened the door cautiously, his senses immediately alert. The woman standing in front of him was as enigmatic as the life he had once lived. Emma Hayes, his old CIA contact. Her dark eyes flickered with urgency, and her expression was one Clint hadn't seen in years. Fear. "Emma," Clint said quietly, ushering her inside. "What the hell are you doing here?" "It's been too long." "I know," she interrupted, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "But we don't have time for pleasantries. You're in serious trouble, Clint. It's not just the fraud case. Someone's targeting you, and I think I know who it is." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He'd always trusted Emma. Back in the day, they had worked side by side on covert missions that took them across the globe, dealing with enemies both foreign and domestic. But now, hearing the tone in her voice, Clint felt a chill creep down his spine. "Who's after me?" Clint asked, his voice steady but filled with underlying tension. "And why now?" Emma looked around the room, making sure no one was listening. She motioned for Clint to sit. As they both settled into the worn leather chairs, she took a deep breath before speaking. "It's the agency, but not the one you think. There's a rogue faction within the CIA. Somehow, they've been running things from the shadows for years, manipulating world events, controlling people like you and me." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "I think they were behind the whole fraud thing. They've planted those accusations, Clint. They've set you up." Clint's mind raced. He had always suspected there was more going on behind the scenes. He knew the agency well, having been involved in its darker, more covert operations. But this was something he hadn't anticipated. A faction within the CIA targeting him? Why? "Why me?" Clint asked, leaning forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't been in the field for years. What could they possibly want from me now?" Emma's gaze hardened. "You were involved in something bigger than you ever realized. Back in the 80s, you uncovered something that they couldn't allow to come to light. They've been covering it up ever since, and now they think you're the loose end. If they take you down, Clint, they can bury everything. Your past, your legacy, and most importantly, the truth." Clint's pulse quickened. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but he still wasn't seeing the whole picture. What had he stumbled upon all those years ago that could bring down an entire covert network? "I need you to help me figure this out," Emma continued, her voice urgent. "You're not just an actor. You're not just a hero on the big screen. You're Clint Eastwood, the man who knows how to navigate the shadows. And right now, those shadows are closing in on you." Clint stared at her, his mind now fully focused. He wasn't just fighting to clear his name. He was fighting for his life, and for the truth to finally come out. The next few days were a blur. Clint and Emma worked quickly, gathering what information they could about the people behind the accusations. Every call they made, every lead they followed, seemed to lead them deeper into a labyrinth of corruption and secrecy, one that stretched far beyond the CIA. It wasn't just about fraud. It was about power, control, and the manipulation of world events. Clint had learned the hard way over the years that when you're dealing with covert operations, nothing is ever as it seems. Every ally could be a potential enemy, and every truth was wrapped in layers of deception. But even so, He couldn't shake the feeling that this was something even bigger than what he'd experienced during his time with the agency. "These people are good," Emma said as they reviewed a set of encrypted files they had obtained from a former CIA analyst who had been part of the rogue faction. "Really good, but not good enough. We're getting close, Clint." Clint nodded. His gut told him they were on the right track. But time was running out. As the fraud case continued to unfold in the media, public opinion turned against him. The once untouchable Clint Eastwood was now being painted as a criminal, a man who had faked his own legacy, deceived the public, and manipulated Hollywood for personal gain. His reputation was in tatters, and the pressure was mounting. One evening, after hours of combing through old case files and government documents, Emma handed Clint a folder. It was marked with a symbol he hadn't seen in years, the CIA's highest-level clearance designation, Omega. Only the most trusted operatives knew about Omega, those who were involved in the agency's most classified, high-stakes operations. "This," Emma said, her voice thick with anticipation, "is what you found back in the 80s. The operation. The thing they've been covering up all this time." Clint opened the folder slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he skimmed through the pages. What he found inside was nothing short of explosive. It detailed a covert mission that had taken place in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. A mission so sensitive that the CIA had gone to extreme lengths to erase all traces of it. But the deeper Clint read, the more he realized the true implications. The mission wasn't just about gathering intelligence. It involved a hidden alliance between CIA operatives and foreign agents, an alliance that had resulted in the manipulation of global politics for decades. And Clint had uncovered it all. Emma's face grew pale as she read over his shoulder. "If they find out you still have this information, Clint, they'll stop at nothing to silence you. They'll destroy your career, your legacy, and your life." Clint closed the folder, his mind racing. He had to make a choice. If he went public with this information, there would be no going back. The people responsible would stop at nothing to take him down. But if he stayed silent, the truth would be buried forever. "You know what we have to do," Emma said softly, reading the look in his eyes. "You have to fight back. Expose them before they can finish what they've started." Clint nodded. He wasn't just fighting for his name anymore. He was fighting for justice. And if there was one thing Clint Eastwood knew how to do, it was fight. The following morning, Clint and Emma laid out their plan. They knew they couldn't take down the rogue faction alone. They needed help, someone inside the CIA who could expose the conspiracy without getting caught in the crossfire. Emma had a contact, a former colleague, now a high-ranking officer in the CIA's Internal Affairs Division. His name was David Klein, and he was one of the few people Emma trusted completely. "We meet him tonight," Emma said, her voice steady. "If anyone can get us access to the right channels, it's him. But be careful, Clint. Klein's reputation is everything, and if he senses any danger, he'll walk away. We can't afford that." Clint, always prepared for the unexpected, nodded. He wasn't a man who easily trusted others, but in this case, he had no choice. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the clock was ticking. As they prepared to meet Klein, Clint's mind turned to the years he had spent in the shadows, training, learning, adapting. He had always been the man who could outlast his enemies, no matter the odds. But now, he wasn't just fighting enemies on the outside. He was fighting a system that had once been his own. And Clint knew, deep down, that the battle for his name and his life was only just beginning. The dimly lit bar was tucked away in a quiet corner of San Francisco, a place where even the most determined reporters would struggle to find. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and low murmurs, the kind of place where people met when they needed to disappear. Clint Eastwood and Emma Hayes sat at a secluded booth, their eyes constantly scanning the room. "Here?" Clint asked, raising an eyebrow as he checked his watch. He hadn't seen David Klein in years, and he wasn't sure what to expect. But one thing was clear. If Klein was still the man he once was, they'd have the ally they needed. Emma nodded, her gaze shifting toward the door. "He'll come. Just stay calm. Don't act like you're too eager. Klein's paranoid, and rightfully so. If he thinks anything's off, he won't show. We need his trust first." Clint leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. He had been in countless situations like this, sitting in dark corners, waiting for the right person to make an appearance. But this was different. This was personal. The people he was about to confront weren't just shadowy figures from his past. They were part of a conspiracy that could take everything he had worked for. His entire legacy was on the line. The door opened, and the room's collective attention shifted for a split second. A man in his early 40s, tall with a thick build, walked in. His clothes were unremarkable, but his posture was rigid, every movement precise. This was a man used to danger, used to living with eyes in the back of his head. David Klein. Clint stood up and met his old colleague halfway. Klein's expression was unreadable, but when their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, an acknowledgement of shared history. "Klein," Clint said, extending a hand. "Long time." Klein shook his hand firmly, his eyes never leaving Clint's face. "Eastwood, you're a hard man to track down." Emma gestured to the booth, and the three of them settled down. As Klein took his seat, his eyes scanned the room again, instinctively checking for anyone who might be watching. It was clear that even in a place like this, Klein didn't take chances. "You've got something important, don't you?" Klein asked, his voice low. Clint nodded. "The CIA is coming after me. They've set me up for fraud, and I think it's part of something much bigger. I need your help to find out who's behind it and why." Klein leaned back, studying Clint and Emma. He didn't say anything at first, just ran his fingers over the edge of his glass. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke again. "I never thought I'd see the day you'd come back to me for help, Clint. After everything that happened." Klein trailed off, but there was no need to finish the sentence. Clint knew what he meant. They had both been part of something bigger, something that had gone sideways years ago. "I didn't come back for you, Klein," Clint said, his voice sharp. "I came because I need answers. There's a rogue faction in the agency, and they're using me to cover something up. Something from the past. I need to know who they are, and how far their reach goes." Klein was silent for a long moment. His eyes darted to Emma, then back to Clint. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tinged with regret. "It's worse than you think, Clint. This faction, whoever they are, they've been pulling the strings for a long time. I've seen their work, and I'm telling you, they don't just control people in the CIA. They have connections everywhere. They've infiltrated not just government agencies, but corporations, media, even foreign governments. Whoever is behind this, they've been setting the stage for decades." Clint felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just about clearing his name. This wasn't about Hollywood. This was about something much larger, something more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. "So what's the next step?" Emma asked, her voice steady but tense. "We need to know who they are and how we can take them down." Klein reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "This," he said, sliding it across the table, "contains everything I've been able to dig up. It's not much, but it's enough to start. If you want to expose them, Clint, you'll need to get this information into the right hands. And fast." Clint picked up the flash drive, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It wasn't just a piece of hardware. It was a ticking time bomb. The moment he plugged it in, there would be no turning back. "You sure this is safe?" Clint asked, narrowing his eyes. Klein didn't flinch. "The files are encrypted. I've hidden them well, but you'll need to move quickly. Whoever's behind this, they're watching you already." Emma glanced over at Clint. "You know what you have to do. The longer we wait, the more chances we give them to bury everything." Clint didn't hesitate. He was a man who had made tough decisions his whole life, and this was no different. He stood up, tucking the flash drive into his jacket pocket. "We'll move tonight," he said, his voice firm. Klein nodded, standing up as well. "Be careful, Clint. The more you dig, the more dangerous it becomes. And remember, trust no one, not even me." With those words, Klein turned and walked out of the bar without another glance. Clint and Emma stayed behind for a moment, both contemplating the weight of what they were about to do. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked, her eyes searching Clint's face. Clint didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His resolve was clear. He had always faced the darkness head-on, whether it was on screen or in the real world. And now, The darkness had found him. "I'm ready," Clint said finally. "Let's finish this." Clint and Emma moved quickly. With the flash drive in hand, they set out for a secure location to decrypt the files. They couldn't afford to trust anyone. Klein had been right about that. Even the CIA had eyes everywhere, and with the stakes this high, there was no room for error. The location they chose was an abandoned safe house Clint had used years ago. Isolated, secure, and off the grid. Once inside, Clint booted up an old laptop that had been specially modified for situations like this, designed to avoid detection from government surveillance programs. As the laptop hummed to life, Clint inserted the flash drive and began to work. The encryption was tough, but Clint's experience in handling sensitive materials kicked in. He knew how to crack these codes. It was like second nature to him. Minutes turned into hours. Finally, the last barrier fell away, and the files were revealed. Clint stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The documents detailed the covert operations, the corrupt deals, the deep connections between the rogue faction and high-ranking officials, not just in the CIA, but across the global intelligence community. The conspiracy was vast, far beyond what Clint had imagined. But it was the last document that caught his attention. It was a list of names, high-profile names, people in the government, in Hollywood, in media, names Clint recognized. And among them, there was one name that stood out above all others. The name that made his blood run cold. "David Klein," Clint muttered, his voice barely audible. "No, this can't be right." Clint sat frozen, his gaze fixed on the screen. The name staring back at him was like a punch to the gut. David Klein. His mind raced, running through every memory of Klein, every conversation, every mission they had worked on together. Klein had always been the reliable one, the steady hand in the chaos. But this didn't make sense. Clint had trusted him. He had to trust him. And now, the very man who had helped him just hours ago was listed as part of the conspiracy. Emma noticed the change in Clint's demeanor. She had been watching him, waiting for some sign of what was going on in his head. She stood up and walked over to him, her boots clicking on the floor as she approached. "Clint?" she asked softly, her voice tense with concern. "What's wrong?" Clint blinked, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he hovered over the keyboard, still unable to tear his eyes away from the screen. "David Klein, he's involved." Emma's eyes widened in shock. She stepped closer to the laptop, looking over Clint's shoulder. "Wait, are you sure? This can't be right." Clint ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the revelation press down on him like a ton of bricks. "It's right. His name is listed here, along with a dozen others. High-ranking officials, people in the CIA, in Hollywood, in media, all of them connected to this faction." His voice was filled with disbelief, tinged with anger. "I thought Klein was on our side. But if he's been working with them all along, then I've been played." Emma stood still for a moment, processing the new information. This changed everything. If Klein was part of the conspiracy, then their whole operation was compromised. Clint's trust in him had been shattered in an instant. But that didn't change the fact that they were in deep. Their next move had to be planned carefully. One wrong step, and they were dead. "Do we confront him now?" Emma asked, her voice cold, controlled. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to know the gravity of what they were facing. Clint shook his head slowly. "No, not yet. We need more proof. We can't just walk in there and accuse him. But we do need to find out who else is involved, and we need to do it without him knowing we're onto him. He's dangerous now, Emma. He's not the man I used to know." Emma's jaw tightened. "Then what's the plan?" Clint turned away from the laptop, his mind working at lightning speed. "We get out there and follow the leads in these files. We find the others on the list, see what we can learn. But we move slowly. We can't trust anyone. Not anymore." Emma nodded. "I'll start looking into the others on the list. We'll need to go under the radar. If they're watching you, Clint, we need to be more careful than ever." Clint rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of their situation. The walls were closing in, and every second felt like a countdown. He was no longer fighting just for his freedom. He was fighting for his life. "We'll meet up later," Clint said. "Check in with your contacts. I'll take care of the rest. But remember, if we're going to get through this, We need to stay ahead of them. And the moment we slip up, it's over. Emma gave a curt nod and moved toward the door. As she exited, Clint sat alone for a moment, staring at the laptop. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, betrayal, fear, but most of all, determination. He would get to the bottom of this. He had to, not just for him, but for the country he had fought for, the people who still depended on him. Clint wasn't used to working in the shadows, but this was no ordinary mission. The CIA had eyes everywhere, and now, he was part of a game that had no rules. Emma had gone off to track down the others on the list, people who might still be loyal to their cause, or at least people who could help them gather more intel. Clint, meanwhile, knew that he had to dig deeper into the files Klein had given him. As much as he hated to admit it, Klein's warning echoed in his mind: trust no one. That included David Klein himself. In the coming hours, Clint went through the documents on the flash drive, parsing through every bit of data. The conspiracy wasn't just high-level. It reached into corporations, foreign intelligence, and even criminal organizations. But there was something that stood out: a series of coded messages, encrypted beyond what Clint could immediately understand. Clint's experience with decrypting files, however, was something he had picked up during his time working with the government. The real challenge was finding a place to decrypt them without raising suspicion. He needed to find a safe house, one that was off the grid. The old network of CIA safe houses had mostly been dismantled or compromised, but Clint had a contact who could help, an old friend from his early days in the agency, Lucas Denholm, a man who could still be trusted. Clint reached for his phone and dialed the number. He waited. Lucas, Clint's voice was low, the urgency evident. I need a favor. Can you get me into a secure location? I've got something that could blow the lid off the whole system. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Clint, what the hell is going on? You're a wanted man. If I help you, I don't have time for explanations, Lucas, Clint snapped. Just get me somewhere safe. And fast. I'll explain later. Lucas sighed. All right, I'll send you the details. Just don't make me regret this. Clint disconnected the call. Lucas had always been the cautious one, but he owed Clint a few favors. And Clint wasn't about to let a few complications stop him now. The safe house was located in a remote area of the California desert, far from the prying eyes of the city. It wasn't fancy, barely a cabin, really, but it was secure. The perfect place to lay low and get to the bottom of the encrypted files. When Clint arrived, Lucas was already waiting for him. He was a tall man, wiry, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had always been a bit of a loner, someone who preferred the quiet life over the chaos that Clint was used to. You still look like you belong in a movie, Clint, Lucas said with a dry chuckle as he helped Clint unload his gear. But I can tell, this is no Hollywood plot. This is real. You're in deep, aren't you? Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. Let's get to work. I need to crack these files. I'm going to need all the help I can get. Lucas led Clint inside the cabin and set up a small computer terminal. As Clint sat down, Lucas started pulling out his own set of tools, everything from advanced decryption software to a handful of flash drives and wires. They worked silently, their fingers flying across the keyboards, trying to break through the layers of encryption protecting the files. Clint glanced over at Lucas. How are things on your end? I need to know if we've been compromised. Lucas paused. I've been watching your back, Clint. You're clean for now. But if someone's tracking you, we might not have much time. Just as Clint was about to respond, the door slammed open. The door flew open with a force that rattled the cabin's frame, and Clint's hand instinctively moved to the gun holstered at his side. He didn't even need to look up to know something had gone wrong. His instincts were sharper now than ever before. The voice that followed confirmed his suspicions. Clint Eastwood, always the tough guy, a cold, smooth voice mocked from the doorway. Clint's heart skipped a beat as he glanced up to find two men standing in the doorway. Their expressions were unreadable, and their movements fluid, like predators who had been stalking their prey for days. One of them was familiar. Too familiar. David, Clint muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. The man standing before him, smiling like nothing had changed, was the same David Klein, the man he had once trusted above all others. Klein's smirk was sharp and knowing. I see you're still fighting the good fight, Clint. But you should know by now, you're way out of your league. You always were. Clint rose slowly from his chair, a sinking feeling in his stomach. The betrayal stung deeper than any enemy bullet could. Klein had been in this for much longer than Clint could ever imagine. The files they'd worked through, Klein had already seen them. Everything that Clint thought was his advantage had already been compromised. I should have known, Clint muttered, half to himself, his voice thick with resentment. You were never really on our side. Lucas, who had been working quietly in the corner, stiffened at the sight of Klein. He moved subtly toward the back door, his hand reaching for the emergency exit just in case this went south. David's eyes flicked toward Lucas, noticing the movement. Don't bother. You won't get far. His hand hovered near his side, where a gun was tucked into his waistband. This is a trap, Clint. I gave you enough time to dig yourself a hole, but now, well, now it's time to end this charade. Clint's jaw clenched. He knew Klein was good, probably one of the best operatives the CIA had ever trained. But there was something more unsettling now. The man in front of him wasn't just some operative anymore. He was a ghost, wrapped in layers of secrets, and Clint was the one caught in the web. We can still make it right, David, Clint said, keeping his tone even, hoping for a break in the tension. We don't have to be enemies. Whatever you've been promised, I'll help you get out. But you need to stop this. Now. Klein chuckled, the sound almost like a hiss. You still don't get it, do you? You were never part of the real plan. You're just a pawn, Clint. Always have been. The second man, a tall figure with a blank expression, stepped forward. He had the look of a man who had seen too many wars, too many betrayals. You have no idea who you're dealing with, the man said, his voice low and guttural. The people Klein works for, they don't care about anything but control. And you, Clint, are just another threat they want erased. Clint didn't back down. Then why don't you come at me, and we'll see who the real threat is. For a moment, the room was still. Clint's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind running through escape routes, contingency plans, any option to get out alive. But there was no easy way out. Not this time. He was surrounded, trapped in the very place he thought he could trust. Klein's lips curled upward. You'll understand soon enough. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everything you fought for. And Clint, you're losing. Clint stood tall, refusing to show any sign of weakness. What's the endgame, Klein? What's your real mission? Who's pulling the strings? Klein looked over at the silent figure behind him, a silent command. The man stepped forward, pulling a file from inside his jacket, dropping it onto the table in front of Clint. Clint glanced at it. The name printed on the cover was chilling, Project Exodus. David's voice dropped to a whisper. It's bigger than you can imagine, and it's already begun. You should have stayed out of it, Clint. Now, the world will pay for your mistake. Clint's eyes darted to the file. He was starting to see the pieces fall into place, but there was still one thing he didn't understand. What does this have to do with me? I'm just a has-been actor, remember? David's laugh was cold and bitter. That's where you're wrong. You were never just an actor. You were the perfect cover. You were in the right place at the right time, and we took advantage of it. But now? Now you're a liability. Clint's blood ran cold. He'd been used as a pawn, just like Klein said, but for something far more insidious than he had ever imagined. David stepped closer, his eyes glinting with malice. The CIA has been infiltrated by those who seek control of everything. Project Exodus is our way of bringing about a new world order, one where the old rules no longer apply. You, Clint, were never meant to walk away from this. Clint's mind raced. He had to make a choice. He could fight, but the odds were stacked against him. Or he could play along, gather more intel, and wait for an opportunity to strike. But time was running out. The walls were closing in, and Clint had no idea how deep the conspiracy went. One thing was clear now. There was no going back. Clint, I'm giving you one last chance to walk away, Klein said, his tone softening, as if he was giving Clint the opportunity to escape unscathed. Take the file and leave. Walk away from the mess you've gotten yourself into. Clint's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of Klein's words, but they didn't faze him. He knew what was at stake now, everything he had ever fought for. "I'm not walking away," Clint said, his voice steady, like a man who had made peace with his fate. "I'm not leaving until I put an end to this." Klein stared at him for a moment, his eyes calculating, assessing. Then, he smiled, eerily calm. "So be it." Suddenly, everything around Clint seemed to blur. His mind went into overdrive, analyzing every exit, every angle, every possibility. In that split second, he saw his opening. David moved slightly, and Clint sprang into action. He dove for the gun in his holster, but it was too late. The world seemed to slow down as Clint's hand reached for his holster. But before he could draw his weapon, the other man, the one with the cold, calculating stare, lunged at him. Clint barely had time to react, but his instincts kicked in. He twisted sideways, using his opponent's momentum to slam him against the wall. The man grunted but recovered quickly, his hands snapping for Clint's throat. Clint wasn't about to let this end in some cheap brawl. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He shoved the man off him, backing toward the table where the file lay. Klein was watching the entire scene with a sinister calm, his hands in his pockets as if this was all part of the game. "You're good, Clint. I'll give you that," Klein said, his voice still dripping with smugness. "But you can't escape the truth." Clint didn't flinch. His mind was already working through his next move. With his back to the wall, he scanned the room quickly, assessing. The emergency exit was still at least 30 feet away, but the window beside him? It was just big enough for a man to slip through. He had to make a move. Now, the man he had thrown into the wall was on his feet, eyes wide with fury. Clint's hand shot out, grabbing a nearby chair and flinging it at him. The man dodged, but that was enough of a distraction. Clint dove for the window, his heart pounding in his chest. As he hoisted himself up, the sound of footsteps echoed in the room behind him. Klein wasn't giving up that easily. Clint's body ached as he squeezed through the narrow opening, but the cold rush of night air filled his lungs as he made it to the outside. For a moment, Clint stood still, listening for any signs of pursuit. His breath came heavy and fast. He had made it out, but the real challenge was just beginning. Klein wouldn't stop until Clint was dead, and with Project Exodus hanging in the balance, Clint knew there was no room for mistakes. He glanced around, realizing he was in a back alley behind the cabin. No cars, no immediate exits, just dark, empty streets stretching ahead. He needed to get to his contacts. He needed a plan. His fingers dialed the number of the one person who might still be on his side. Clint sat in the back of a nondescript van, his body tense as the city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows. The man beside him, Lucas, had gone quiet after Clint's escape, giving him the space he needed to think. "You're really going through with this, huh?" Lucas asked, his voice low. "I mean, after everything?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. Not when his mind was still caught on the haunting realization. Project Exodus wasn't just a CIA project. It was a global conspiracy, and he had just stumbled into the heart of it. Klein was right about one thing. Clint had always been a pawn, but now, he was more than that. He was a threat. "I have to see this through, Lucas," Clint finally said, his voice firm. "Klein's playing a dangerous game. I can't just walk away." "Yeah, but you're running out of allies." "Fast," Lucas replied, glancing over at him. Clint turned to face him, a shadow of a grin forming on his lips. "I've never needed many allies. Just the right ones." Lucas raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, the van swerved sharply, throwing Clint against the side. His heart skipped a beat as the driver cursed under his breath. "Ambush!" the driver shouted, jerking the wheel again as gunfire rang out from the alley ahead. Clint's body moved on instinct, reaching for the weapon he'd hidden under his jacket. He felt the weight of it, the familiarity of the cold steel that had served him well in countless operations. As the van screeched to a halt, he kicked open the side door, his senses heightened. The world outside was dark, but the staccato sounds of gunfire filled the night. Without thinking, Clint dove out of the van, landing on the ground and rolling to his feet in one fluid motion. Lucas followed, pulling out his own weapon as the two men sprinted for cover. They're closing in, Lucas yelled. Clint's mind raced. He couldn't stay in this alley. He needed higher ground, somewhere with a better vantage point. Come on, he shouted, motioning for Lucas to follow as he veered left toward an abandoned building. The gunfire intensified as the men pursued. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, but his thoughts were razor-sharp. This wasn't just an ambush. This was a warning. Klein was pulling out all the stops, and Clint knew he was being tested. He burst through the building's broken door, quickly scanning for an exit route. Lucas followed closely behind, but the sounds of footsteps grew louder, too loud. They had to move fast. Upstairs. Now, Clint ordered, taking the stairs 2 at a time. They reached the second floor and found a momentary lull in the chaos. For just a second, they had breathing room. Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow. We're surrounded. We won't make it out of here. Clint looked at him, his eyes fierce. That's where you're wrong, Lucas. We will make it out, but we need a plan. He glanced around the room, his mind working at lightning speed. There were 2 ways out of this. 1, they could fight their way through, but with the way things were going, that would be a death sentence. The second option? They needed information, and they needed it now. Project Exodus, Clint muttered to himself. The name echoed in his mind like a ticking clock. If we get to the archives, before he could finish his thought, the sound of boots pounding up the stairs interrupted him. Clint turned to Lucas, his expression hard. Get ready, he said, eyes steely. And with that, they charged toward the stairwell, ready for whatever came next. Clint's heart thudded in his chest as the footsteps grew louder, each one a relentless reminder that time was running out. The door to the stairs creaked, and before Clint could even blink, a figure appeared at the top, silhouetted by the dim light from below. The man didn't hesitate. He raised his gun, aiming directly at Clint. Without thinking, Clint dropped low and rolled to the side, pulling Lucas with him as bullets thudded into the wooden floor where they had just been standing. The adrenaline shot through him like fire, and for a split second, the world seemed to slow down. He couldn't afford to stay here. They were too exposed. Up. Move. Clint shouted, already sprinting toward the far side of the room, dragging Lucas along. There was a ladder leading up to the roof, and they had no choice but to take it. But as Clint reached the ladder, the sound of more boots echoing from below confirmed his fear. The building was crawling with enemies. They weren't just after him. They were after the files. Clint threw the ladder up and began to climb, feeling the weight of Lucas right behind him. His mind was focused. No distractions, no mistakes. He couldn't afford to fail now. Not when the fate of Project Exodus hung in the balance. When they reached the top of the roof, Clint turned to Lucas. We need to get to that archive before they do. It's the only way to stop Klein and his operation. Lucas, panting, wiped his forehead. Are you sure? We're practically dead men walking. Clint's eyes flicked to the alley where more gunmen were pouring in from every direction. He could hear the heavy footfalls growing closer. We don't have a choice, Clint said, determination setting in his voice. The truth is out there, and I'm going to make sure it sees the light of day. Without waiting for a response, Clint bolted across the rooftop, Lucas following close behind. The buildings around them were dark and looming, and the streets below were filled with shadows, but Clint's mind was laser-focused. The archive wasn't far, but it was going to be a hell of a journey to get there undetected. Klein stood in the shadows of a narrow alley, watching through the night vision scope of his rifle. He had Clint in his sights again. The old man was tough. Clint had been trained for years to handle situations like this, but Klein knew it was only a matter of time before Clint's luck ran out. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, his eyes narrowing when he saw the message. Clint Eastwood, target, 100% compromised. Klein's fingers tightened around the phone. Phase 2 was the final step in wiping Clint off the map. No more games. No more chances. The CIA would never find out what had really happened. No one would. Project Exodus would proceed as planned. Clint and Lucas crouched low, making their way across the rooftop with the stealth of 2 men trying to blend into the night. Clint's breathing was steady, his every move deliberate. He had been in tight spots before, but this one was different. Klein's network was vast, and even the smallest slip-up could cost him everything. 5 blocks to the archive, Clint muttered, scanning the streets below. The headlights of a car turned the corner, its bright beams cutting through the darkness. They crouched down, waiting until it passed. We need to stay out of sight. Lucas nodded, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. So, what's the plan when we get there? Break in, find the files, and what? What's the endgame, Clint? Clint paused, turning to face his friend. He could see the doubt in Lucas's eyes, understandable, considering the mess they were in, but Clint couldn't afford to let that doubt infect him. We get the files. We expose Project Exodus to the public. The CIA's infiltration can't continue. If we fail, everything we've fought for will be buried under a lie. Lucas gave a shaky nod. He was scared. Hell, Clint was too. But there was no turning back. They continued their silent trek across rooftops, moving swiftly and staying low. Every once in a while, Clint would glance down at the street below, his mind calculating their next move. They were getting closer. Too close to turn back now. Clint paused at the edge of the final rooftop before the archive building. The structure was looming and imposing, with a security guard visible at the front entrance. There were cameras, too. Every corner of the building was watched. It was going to take everything Clint had to infiltrate it without getting noticed. "We need to get down there," Clint whispered. He turned to Lucas, who was already thinking along the same lines. "You have a plan?" Lucas asked, looking from the guard to the dark alley beside the building. Clint smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. "You could say that." He crouched low and took a deep breath. The time for subtlety was over. He darted across the roof, moving like a shadow. His body pressed close to the wall of the building as he reached the edge. He glanced back, confirming Lucas was with him, and then leapt down into the alley, landing in a roll that absorbed the impact. Lucas followed with ease, though Clint could see the fear in his eyes. They were both alive for now, but it wouldn't last long. "We stick to the shadows," Clint said in a whisper, and they moved as one, keeping to the dark alley, just a few paces ahead of the security guard. Clint's pulse raced in his veins as he approached the back door of the building. This was it. No more second chances. With a quick, calculated motion, he pulled out his lockpick tools and got to work on the back entrance. The door clicked open with a soft sound, and Clint and Lucas slipped inside, the cold, sterile air of the building rushing around them. The archive room was just ahead. Clint could feel the weight of his mission pressing down on him as they crept through the halls. Every noise, every creak of the floor beneath their boots seemed amplified in the stillness. But they couldn't stop now, not when the truth was within reach. Clint's eyes scanned the shelves of files, his pulse quickening. There were thousands of documents here, but only a handful were relevant to Project Exodus. And then there it was. The file was sitting innocuously on a shelf labeled Classified Operations. Clint grabbed it and held it close, a sense of urgency flooding him. But just as he turned to leave, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the hall. Clint's heart skipped a beat as the footsteps echoed louder, closer now. There was no time to waste. He clutched the file in his hand, fingers trembling but his resolve hardening. This was it, the moment he had worked so long and so hard for. But as the footsteps drew near, Clint's mind raced. They didn't have the luxury of a quick escape, not now. They were too deep inside, too exposed. "Lucas, get ready," Clint hissed under his breath, his voice low and steady. "We're not walking out of here. We fight our way out if we have to." Lucas, who had been crouching low beside him, nodded silently, already adjusting his grip on the gun. Clint quickly scanned the room again, looking for an exit. The back door was out of the question now, too risky. They'd need to find another way out of this hellhole and fast. Suddenly, the door to the hallway creaked open, and a shadow passed under the thin crack at the bottom of the door. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the guard muttering to himself, probably checking his watch, unaware that 2 intruders were hiding just inches away. "Now," Clint whispered, making the decision. He grabbed Lucas by the shoulder and pulled him toward a narrow corridor leading to the back of the building. Their footsteps were light as they moved, the sound almost swallowed by the building's dull hum. They crept around the corner, and Clint quickly assessed their surroundings. There was a small storage closet up ahead, a perfect place to hide. The sound of the approaching guard's boots grew louder, closer still. Clint held his breath. He wasn't afraid of dying. Not anymore. But he wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. Without warning, Clint pushed open the closet door, and he and Lucas squeezed inside, leaving just enough of the door ajar to peek through. The tension was thick in the air. They could hear the guard's voice now, muffled but unmistakable. Must be in here somewhere. Klein will have our heads if we let him slip away again. Clint's muscles tensed. The guard had no idea how close he was to finding them. One wrong move, and they'd be done for. But just as the footsteps halted outside their door, the building suddenly shook. The ground trembled beneath them, sending both men to their knees. What the hell was that? Lucas gasped, his eyes wide with confusion. Clint's instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed Lucas by the arm, pulling him upright. Stay low. We don't know what's going on, but it's bad. Stay quiet. They heard more explosions in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of alarms blaring. It was chaos now. The building had been compromised. Clint and Lucas exchanged a glance. This was their chance. The confusion would make it easier to move undetected. Clint didn't hesitate. He grabbed the file once again and motioned for Lucas to follow. They slipped out of the closet and into the hallway, using the noise from the explosions and alarms as cover. Outside, the city was in a full-blown panic. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the night sky was lit up with flashes of orange and red. Clint's mind raced. He needed answers, but the chaos unfolding around him only added to the confusion. As they emerged from the back of the building, Clint's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of an escape route. The street ahead was blocked with cars, and the sounds of sirens screamed in the distance. They needed to disappear. Fast. Suddenly, a car screeched to a halt in front of them. The windows were tinted black, the vehicle looking like it could have belonged to any number of government agents or private contractors. But there was no time to hesitate. The window rolled down, and a familiar face appeared. Get in. Now, the voice was low, but commanding. Clint recognized the figure immediately, Harris, an old contact from his early days in the CIA. Harris had saved his life more than once, and now, Clint had to decide, trust him or risk everything by going alone. Without a word, Clint shoved Lucas toward the car, his heart thundering in his chest. They both climbed into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind them with finality. As soon as the car sped off, Clint turned to Harris, his voice urgent. What the hell is going on? Who's behind this? Harris's face was grim. It's Klein, Clint, and you've just uncovered more than you realize. Project Exodus is only the beginning. Clint frowned, his grip tightening on the file. What do you mean? What's the real purpose? Harris hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing whether or not to reveal everything. Klein and his team have been orchestrating global instability for years. Project Exodus is a weapon, biological, chemical, and cyber all rolled into one. They're planning to unleash chaos worldwide, controlling everything in their wake. And you just walked right into their core operation. Clint's mind reeled at the enormity of the situation. Project Exodus wasn't just a corporate espionage operation. It was global manipulation. Klein wasn't just trying to control governments. He was trying to rewrite the very structure of power itself. If Klein succeeds, we're talking about a new world order, Clint said, his voice darkening. And no one will be safe. Not even the people who think they're in charge. Harris nodded grimly. Exactly. The only way to stop him now is to go straight to the top. But they're coming for you, Clint. They know you're a threat now. You can't hide forever. Clint glanced at Lucas, who had gone pale. We don't need to hide. We need to take down Klein, and we need to do it before he activates the final phase of the project. Harris's eyes met Clint's, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. You're right. But if we're going to do this, we need to get to the main facility, the vault. That's where the core data is stored. If we get there first, we can shut it down. If Klein gets there first, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Clint's jaw clenched. This was it, the final mission. And this time, there would be no room for mistakes. The car sped through the chaos of the city streets, sirens wailing and helicopters whirling overhead, adding to the sense of urgency and impending disaster. Clint leaned back in the seat, staring out the window, his mind working through every possible angle. The vault, a high-security facility buried deep in the heart of a secluded military compound. If the core data was there, then it was their only chance to stop Klein's operation. But Clint knew one thing. Getting in would be the easy part. Getting out alive? That was the real challenge. "We need a plan," Clint said, breaking the silence that had settled over the car. "The vault's security system will be impenetrable. Klein's people don't mess around." Harris nodded, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel as he weaved through the blocked streets. "I've got an in. I've worked with a guy on the inside, a former operative who owes me a favor. He's still there. If we get to him, he can help us breach the vault's defenses." Clint's eyes narrowed. "You trust him?" "Not fully," Harris said with a wry smile. "But he's our best shot. And right now, that's all we've got." They drove in silence for a few more minutes, the hum of the engine and the occasional shout or crash from the streets outside serving as the only soundtrack to their thoughts. Lucas, still clutching the file with a white-knuckled grip, glanced nervously between the two men. "What exactly are we going to find in this vault, Clint? You said we could stop Klein. But how?" Clint glanced back at him, his gaze steady. "What's in that vault is the key to everything. The files. The proof that Klein has been pulling the strings all over the world. If we can expose that, it'll blow this whole thing wide open." Harris swerved the car around a corner, and Clint's attention snapped back to their route. The compound was just ahead, hidden in a quiet section of the city where few would think to look. But Clint knew it would be swarming with guards. Military-grade security, armed forces, and Klein's private mercenaries. Nothing short of an army would be stationed there. But as they neared the compound, Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, the sudden noise breaking through the tension. He pulled it out quickly and checked the screen. It was a message from an encrypted number. "They know. Stay sharp. Backup is on the way." Klein has eyes everywhere. Clint's stomach clenched. They knew he was coming. And now, the clock was ticking faster. Harris brought the car to a screeching halt near a small side entrance hidden by overgrown trees. It was a maintenance gate, used by staff and maintenance crews to avoid the main entrance security. They couldn't go through the front. That would be suicide. Clint threw open the door and motioned for Lucas to follow. He didn't wait for Harris. He was already sprinting toward the small security booth next to the gate. They couldn't afford to waste any time. A guard was sitting inside, half asleep, eyes glued to the computer monitor in front of him. Clint's mind worked fast. He had done this before, but this time it wasn't just for the job. This time, it was personal. The guard didn't notice Clint until the very last second. Clint moved in, silent as a shadow, and in one smooth motion, grabbed the guard from behind, covering his mouth before he could make a sound. With a quick twist, Clint had the guard on the ground, unconscious. Lucas stood back, wide-eyed. "I've never seen anyone move like that." Clint straightened up, wiping his hands. "Keep up. We don't have time for compliments." They made their way through the now unlocked gate, the compound sprawling out before them. The area was vast, surrounded by high fences and watchtowers. They could see guards patrolling, but it wasn't a fortified military installation, just an isolated compound that hid more than anyone could imagine. "We're going in through the east entrance," Clint said, his voice low but firm. "Harris said we can meet our contact in a safe house near the facility's perimeter. Once we're in, we can start making our way to the vault." Clint moved quickly, slipping from shadow to shadow, careful not to draw attention. They'd been spotted a couple of times already, but Clint's instincts had kept them one step ahead. He wasn't sure how much longer that luck would hold out. They arrived at a small, nondescript building on the east side of the compound, wedged between two larger, more intimidating structures. It looked like a utility shed, nothing to draw attention, but Clint knew better. This was the place where they'd meet the operative who could get them inside the vault. The door opened silently as Clint knocked 3 times, his hand never straying far from his gun. The man who answered was short, grizzled, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sharp, though, scanning Clint and Lucas before he stepped aside. You're late, the man growled, locking the door behind them. Had some unexpected company, Clint replied, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You've got the way in? The man eyed Clint warily, then gestured for them to sit. I can get you to the vault, but there's no guarantees. The place is crawling with surveillance, and Klein's people are everywhere. I'm counting on you, Clint said, locking eyes with the man. We don't have a lot of time. They'll be coming for us soon. The operative nodded and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet from his jacket. He quickly inputted a series of codes, then slid the tablet across the table to Clint. The screen flickered to life, revealing a detailed blueprint of the compound. This is the layout, the operative said. The vault is 3 levels underground. Security is tight, but there's a maintenance shaft that will bypass most of the cameras and guards. It's the only way in. Clint studied the map. It was more complex than he'd imagined, with multiple layers of security. Biometric locks, retina scans, and automated defenses designed to stop anyone from reaching the core data. There's no way we can get through all that undetected, Lucas said, his voice tight with anxiety. We'll have to make our own luck, Clint replied. If we get caught, it's over. But if we don't, we won't get caught, Harris interrupted, suddenly appearing at the doorway. I've got your back. Clint didn't have time for pleasantries. He needed results. He stood up, making his decision. Let's move. Now. The air inside the maintenance shaft was thick and stale, the kind of atmosphere that told Clint this part of the compound hadn't seen human activity in years. The low hum of the ventilation system was the only sound as they descended deeper into the belly of the beast. They moved quickly, the walls of the narrow shaft barely wide enough for Clint and Lucas to squeeze through side by side. Harris led the way, his flashlight casting long shadows on the concrete walls. Clint followed, scanning every corner and listening intently for any sounds of movement. The tension was unbearable. One wrong move and their entire mission could come to an abrupt end. Clint's mind raced. This is it. If we get through here, we might have a shot at stopping Klein. But if we fail, it's not just our lives on the line anymore. It's the world's. Just keep your head down, Clint whispered to Lucas, who was struggling to keep up, his eyes wide with fear. We can't afford to make any noise. Lucas nodded, but Clint could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his hands trembled slightly as he clutched the file with Klein's classified documents. The file was their last bargaining chip, the key to unlocking everything, but it also made them a target. Ahead, Harris paused and turned, whispering urgently. We're close. The vault's below us. Stay sharp. Clint nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They were getting closer to the heart of Klein's operation, but the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. Every step felt like they were descending into the unknown, and Clint knew they had little time before the compound would be crawling with Klein's mercenaries, looking for anyone who didn't belong. The maintenance shaft opened into a cold, metallic hallway that stretched ahead into the darkness. A few low lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift with every step. Clint motioned for the others to follow and crept forward, moving as silently as possible. They reached a heavy steel door, far thicker and more secure than anything they had seen so far. Clint studied it carefully, noting the high-tech security panel beside it. The door was more than just a barrier. It was the first line of defense in Klein's final fortress. This is it, Clint murmured. Get ready. Harris moved up to the panel, pulling out a small device from his jacket. He plugged it into the panel and typed in a series of commands. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Clint could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, with a soft click, the heavy door began to slide open. Clint exhaled slowly, but his relief was short-lived. The room beyond wasn't empty. 2 armed guards were positioned near the center, standing watch over the vault's core security system. Clint's mind raced. There was no way they could get past them without a confrontation. Harris tapped Clint on the shoulder, gesturing toward a set of crates stacked against the wall. They would have to take them out fast. Clint nodded sharply, signaling for Lucas to stay low. They moved swiftly to the crates, their movements precise and fluid, knowing they only had one shot at this. As they reached the crates, Clint felt the familiar rush of adrenaline surge through him. His muscles tensed, his mind sharpening. This was the part he hated. The violence, the danger, the chaos. But it was necessary. Without warning, Clint leapt from behind the crates, charging toward the first guard. The man didn't have time to react before Clint slammed into him, sending him to the ground with a bone-crushing impact. The second guard turned, but Clint was faster. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, pushing him against the cold wall with a grunt. "Stay down," Clint snarled, his voice low and deadly. The guard struggled for a moment, but quickly realized that resistance would be futile. Clint kept a firm grip on the second guard as Harris quickly neutralized the first one with a swift strike to the neck. Within seconds, both guards were incapacitated, sprawled on the floor in a heap. "We're in," Harris said, his voice calm as ever, despite the adrenaline rushing through him. "Let's go." Clint didn't waste any time. He motioned for Lucas to follow, and they made their way into the heart of the vault, a massive, high-tech control center. The walls were lined with screens displaying live feeds of surveillance footage, data encryption protocols, and maps of Klein's global network. And in the center of it all was a secure terminal, a terminal that, Clint knew, held the key to everything. Lucas stepped forward, wide-eyed. "This is it. We're going to shut him down." Clint nodded. "Just stay focused. We don't know how much time we have." Harris stepped up to the terminal, typing in a series of codes with lightning speed. "I've bypassed the outer defenses, but we need to be quick. Klein's people will be on us any second." Clint scanned the room, checking every corner, every camera, as his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something wasn't right. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Clint's instinct screamed, "No." A voice crackled over the intercom, cold and menacing. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine, Clint?" Clint's blood ran cold. "Klein." His voice dripped with malice and arrogance, as though he had already won. "You should have stayed out of this, old man. You're too late." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. Just as Harris managed to crack the final layer of encryption, the room began to shake. The walls rattled with the force of an explosion, just the first of many to come. The entire compound was under lockdown. "Move," Clint shouted, pushing Lucas toward the door. "Harris, what the hell's happening?" "The system's been compromised," Harris said, his face going pale. "Klein triggered the failsafe. The whole building's going into lockdown. We need to get out. Now." Clint looked at the terminal one last time. The data was halfway through downloading, just enough to expose Klein's operation to the world. But it wasn't finished. The system would self-destruct in minutes. They were running out of time. He grabbed the file, stuffing it into his jacket. "Forget the download. Let's go." The alarms blared louder now, and the compound was in full lockdown. The lights flickered again, casting a red glow over the hallways as Clint, Lucas, and Harris sprinted toward the exit. The entire building seemed to be closing in around them, the doors locking, the corridors narrowing. Every moment felt like it could be their last. As they neared the exit, Clint heard the unmistakable sound of boots pounding behind them. Klein's men were closing in. "Get to the car," Clint shouted. "Now." The trio burst through a side exit, the cool night air hitting them like a slap in the face. They ran across the compound's outer grounds, the sound of gunfire and explosions growing louder with every step. They were close, just a few more yards, and they'd make it to the edge of the compound. The car was waiting for them, engines revving, its headlights cutting through the darkness. But as they reached the gate, Clint's world went black. Clint's head was throbbing as he regained consciousness, the world around him spinning. For a few seconds, he couldn't make sense of where he was. The air was cold, sharp, and the ground felt hard beneath him. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. The last thing he remembered was the explosion. His body had been thrown against the cold concrete. His hand shot up to his head, feeling the warm trickle of blood from a gash above his right eyebrow. "Clint, you're awake," a voice said, panic laced in the words. It was Harris. Clint could barely make out his face, but he could hear the urgency in his voice. Clint tried to sit up, his body screaming in protest. What happened? We were hit by a secondary explosion. Klein's men. Harris's voice trailed off, frustration lining every syllable. We're not going to make it if we don't move. The data. Did you get the file? Clint's mind snapped back into focus. The file. The key to everything. The whole world was counting on it. He fumbled in his jacket and felt the familiar weight of the file tucked safely inside. Yeah, Clint growled, still disoriented. We got it. Now let's get out of here. Harris pulled Clint to his feet with surprising strength, though Clint could feel the dizziness beginning to lift. He blinked again and realized they were on the outskirts of the compound. The car was just a few hundred yards away, but there was a catch. Klein's mercenaries were closing in fast. We've got company, Lucas hissed, his voice a strained whisper. Clint turned to see him crouched low, peeking from behind a stack of crates. A group of heavily armed men had gathered at the far side of the compound, moving in their direction with deadly precision. Clint clenched his jaw. I need a minute. Harris grabbed Clint's arm, pulling him into a crouch. You're not getting a minute, Clint. The building's still coming down. We need to move now. Clint knew Harris was right. He could feel the compound shaking from the last blast. There wasn't much time. He motioned to Lucas. Get ready. We're going on foot. The three of them moved quickly, low to the ground, through the dark, maze-like paths of the compound's exterior. Every step felt like a race against time, and Clint's instincts told him the clock was ticking. They had to get that data into the hands of the right people before Klein's men could destroy it or, worse, use it to turn the tide in their favor. Clint led the way, moving with precision, his every sense on high alert. He could hear the faint sound of boots behind them, the soft, rhythmic pounding of enemy soldiers in pursuit. Harris pulled out his silenced pistol, taking out two guards who had appeared in the shadows, their faces masked with fury and determination. One after another, the bodies dropped without a sound. We're almost there, Clint muttered under his breath. The end of the compound was within sight. Just a few more steps, and they'd be at the fence, the car waiting just beyond it. But as they neared the final stretch, a shout echoed through the night. There they are. Don't let them escape. Clint's pulse raced as the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. He whipped around, instincts kicking in. A dozen mercenaries were sprinting toward them, weapons raised. Go. Now. Clint shouted, adrenaline surging through his body. They broke into a run, the fence now just a few dozen yards ahead. But with every step, the distance between them and the soldiers seemed to shrink. Gunfire buzzed past Clint's head, but he didn't dare slow down. He could feel the weight of the file burning against his chest, reminding him of what was at stake. He didn't have time for this. Not now. Suddenly, Lucas yelped, falling to the ground with a grunt. Lucas! Clint shouted, but Harris was already there, pulling him up with a grunt of effort. The younger man had taken a bullet in his leg. Keep going, Lucas muttered, gritting his teeth as he clutched his leg. I'll hold them off. Clint's heart sank, but he didn't hesitate. No, we're in this together. Get the data out of here, Lucas said through clenched teeth. Just go. We'll be fine. Clint wanted to argue, to say that they couldn't leave anyone behind. But there was no time, and deep down, he knew that Lucas was right. If they didn't get the file out, none of it would matter. Clint nodded sharply, his eyes meeting Harris's. The decision was made. Clint and Harris made a break for it, zigzagging toward the fence, staying as low as possible to avoid being an easy target. Behind them, Lucas fired off shots, buying them a few precious seconds, but Clint knew that wouldn't last long. The guards were closing in fast. They reached the fence. Clint didn't hesitate. He grabbed the chain link and, with one swift motion, pulled it apart just enough for them to squeeze through. He felt a sharp pang of guilt as he glanced back one last time at Lucas, but there was nothing he could do. We'll come back for him, Clint said, though his words felt hollow. Harris didn't reply, but the look on his face was enough to show Clint that he shared the same thought. They made it to the car, engines roaring to life. Clint threw himself into the passenger seat, feeling the engine hum beneath him as the car peeled out, racing toward the road that led them away from the chaos. As the compound faded into the distance, Clint finally allowed himself to take a breath. As the car sped down the desolate highway, Clint leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. The mission was far from over. Klein was still out there, and he had no idea what kind of wrath the man was about to unleash in retaliation. "What now?" Harris asked, his voice low, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Clint glanced at him, then at the file still clenched in his hands. He could almost feel the significance of it, the burden of it. "We take this to the right people," Clint said. "We make sure Klein can't hurt anyone else." "You're sure about this?" Harris asked. "You know what this file will do to him if it gets out." Clint's jaw tightened. "I know, but the world needs to know. And if Klein thinks he's won, then we've lost everything." He looked out the window, the darkness of the road stretching ahead. The rain started to fall, soft at first, but soon a downpour. This was it. The final battle was just beginning. Clint's mind was a whirlwind of calculations, scenarios, and possibilities. He stared out of the passenger window as the rain hammered the glass, watching the occasional flicker of streetlights through the storm. His fingers tightly gripped the file, as if the weight of it might somehow anchor him to the ground. This is it. Everything's riding on this. Behind the wheel, Harris's eyes flickered between the road and the rearview mirror, tension etched in every line of his face. "We've still got a few hours before we hit the drop point," Harris muttered, his voice grim. "But Klein's going to be expecting us." Clint's mind flashed to the faces of the people he'd seen in the compound. They were just trying to survive. And Klein? He'd be relentless. They'd already cost him one of his men, and now the clock was ticking, both for them to deliver the file and for Klein's next move. "The question is," Clint said, rubbing his hand over his face, "how do we get this file into the right hands without the whole world coming after it?" Harris gave a dry chuckle. "I wish I knew. But if anyone can do it, it's you." Clint frowned. "I'm not sure about that anymore." The car hummed as they cut through the rain-soaked streets, but the heavy feeling in the air weighed down on Clint. As they neared the drop point, a secluded area hidden deep in the city, the quiet became almost suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the beat of the rain. Harris pulled the car off to the side of a deserted alley, cutting the engine. The silence in the car felt deafening now. Clint could see the strain in Harris's eyes, the kind of exhaustion that only comes from having fought a war you weren't ready for. A war that wasn't even yours. "We're here," Clint said, glancing at his watch. The contact they'd arranged would be there soon, but the seconds felt like hours. The rain intensified, battering the car's windows as Clint and Harris waited in the stillness. It was hard to shake the nagging feeling that someone was watching them. The file had cost them everything: lives, trust, and even sanity. If Klein's mercenaries were still trailing them, they were in deeper danger than ever. "Are you sure this contact can be trusted?" Harris asked, breaking the silence. His tone was cautious, but Clint could hear the doubt that lingered. Clint didn't reply immediately. Trust had never been something that came easy to him, especially now. It had taken him years to carve a life of his own, and yet, one decision had put everything at risk. "The CIA's been working with him for months," Clint finally said, a tightness in his chest as he stared at the darkened alley outside. "If they were compromised, we'd already be dead." There was no way Clint was walking out of this with just the file. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would work out in the end, but there was still a small chance. And that, at least, kept him going. Minutes passed before headlights pierced the alley. Clint's heart rate spiked as the sound of tires on wet pavement signaled the arrival of their contact. A black SUV pulled into the alley, its windows tinted. The doors swung open, and a figure in a long, dark coat emerged. Clint squinted against the rain, trying to make out the silhouette, but the person remained just out of reach in the shadows. Clint slowly stepped out of the car, Harris following behind him, hand instinctively resting on his gun. The tension in the air was palpable. The figure stepped forward, and Clint's breath hitched when he saw the face. It was Agent Walker. "Clint," Walker said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "Good to see you. I take it the mission went well?" Clint's eyes narrowed. Walker had been one of the few agents Clint trusted completely, but now, Seeing him here, something felt off. Walker's casual demeanor felt like a warning, like a trap that had been waiting to snap shut. Clint didn't move. "What's going on here, Walker? You're not supposed to be part of this exchange." Walker gave a soft laugh, the sound eerily calm. "Oh, Clint, I wish things were that simple. But you've got to understand. I can't just let this file slip through my fingers." Clint's stomach twisted as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His hand instinctively reached for the file in his jacket, his body tensing. "You're with Klein. All along, you were working for him." Walker smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "It was never about working for Klein, Clint. It was always about the bigger picture." Clint's blood ran cold. He wasn't sure how to process the sudden shift, the betrayal that seemed to come out of nowhere. The man who had once been a trusted ally was now his enemy. "You've been playing both sides," Clint said, his voice a low growl. "Not playing, Clint," Walker replied, his tone turning serious. "Surviving. You just weren't supposed to be the one to find out." Clint's mind raced. So this was the game. This was the plan all along. And they had played him every step of the way. But Clint wasn't backing down. "Not now. You're not getting the file, Walker," Clint said, his voice resolute. For a split second, Clint saw Walker's eyes flicker with something. Regret, perhaps, or recognition that Clint wasn't someone to be underestimated. But it vanished quickly, replaced by cold indifference. Without warning, Walker lunged for the file. Clint reacted on instinct. He ducked, and the force of the collision sent him sprawling to the wet ground. The file slipped from his jacket, and for a heart-stopping moment, Clint thought he had lost everything. Harris moved in an instant, drawing his gun and aiming at Walker. "Get away from him," Harris shouted, but Clint was already back on his feet, grabbing the file and securing it against his chest. Walker paused, eyes flickering to Harris, then back to Clint. "You really think you can stop me, Clint?" Clint's gaze was steely. "You've underestimated me, Walker. That's your mistake." Harris took a step forward, the gun unwavering. "You're outnumbered, Walker. And you're not walking out of this with the file." Walker didn't flinch. Instead, he backed off slowly, but his eyes were filled with cold rage. "This isn't over, Clint. You may have the file, but you don't know what's coming next." Clint felt a wave of unease, but he didn't let it show. "We'll see about that," he said, turning toward the car. As they climbed back into the SUV, the rain seemed to come down even harder, as if the storm itself was a reflection of the chaos that was about to explode. As the car sped off into the night, Clint's mind raced. Walker's words echoed in his ears. "You don't know what's coming next." But Clint did know one thing. Klein wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. And now, Clint had the power to bring everything crashing down. But the question remained. Was he ready to pay the price? The cold night air was suffocating, but Clint couldn't shake the burning sensation in his gut. The file, now tucked under his jacket, was heavier than it had ever been. Not just in terms of its physical weight, but the weight of its consequences. The moment they'd gotten into the car and left the alley, Clint had known there was no turning back. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, clearing the rain as Harris drove. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. His mind as heavy with tension as Clint's. "You think Walker's got backup waiting for us?" Harris asked, his voice strained. Clint didn't answer right away. His thoughts were too tangled in the night's events to form any coherent response. The fact that Walker, someone who had been a trusted ally, was in on the whole operation had shattered everything Clint thought he knew. But the betrayal wasn't the only thing that stung. It was the looming realization that their escape plan had just crumbled to dust. "No," Clint said, finally breaking the silence. If Klein was tracking us, Walker would have said something by now. He wouldn't risk confrontation unless he was sure he could win. Harris shot him a glance. "And you trust him? After all that?" Clint didn't trust anyone anymore, not even himself. "I don't trust Walker, but I know how Klein works. He won't let us go easily." Harris turned onto a side street, the car skimming along narrow, dimly lit roads. Clint's mind was a maze of strategies, trying to figure out their next move. He was all too aware of the danger surrounding them. Walker wasn't the only one who had an interest in the file. Klein had built an empire around controlling information, and that file was the key to everything. And Clint? He wasn't about to let it fall into the wrong hands. The plan was simple, or at least it had been. Now, it was all about survival. Clint knew they had to get the file to someone who could not only take it but ensure its safety. But that wasn't as easy as it sounded. The CIA had their hands full with Klein's network, and any attempt to directly reach out to them would make them a target. Walker's betrayal had sealed that door shut. "You know, Clint," Harris said, his voice low, "if this goes wrong, we're both done." Clint's gaze turned toward him, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror. Harris wasn't wrong. It was all or nothing now. The kind of gamble Clint wasn't sure he could walk away from. "I know," Clint replied, his voice calm, "but we don't have a choice." As they neared their destination, a small, nondescript building tucked away in the heart of the city, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of traffic muted under the cover of the storm. The building was a safe house, one of the few places Clint knew he could trust. But the moment they pulled up to the entrance, he knew something wasn't right. The door was ajar. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He reached for his gun, his muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. Harris saw the movement and immediately followed suit, sliding his own gun from its holster. They exchanged a glance before stepping out of the car, silent but alert. The building was dark, except for the faint flicker of light from a single overhead bulb. Clint motioned for Harris to follow as they moved cautiously toward the door. Every step was deliberate, every sound magnified by the stillness of the night. They entered the hallway, their footsteps muffled against the damp carpet. The place reeked of mildew and dust, but it was secure. At least, it had been. Clint gestured to a room at the end of the hall. That's where they were supposed to meet their contact, a low-level operative who could get them the help they needed. But as they approached the door, Clint stopped. There was blood, a small pool of it, near the door. Clint's pulse quickened, his mind racing. Harris looked at him, his face a mirror of concern. "Do you think?" Harris started, but Clint didn't wait for him to finish. He pushed the door open, gun raised. Inside, the room was a mess. The furniture was overturned, and the contact was slumped against the wall, blood staining his clothes. His eyes were wide open, glassy, lifeless. Clint's stomach churned. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a message. Someone knew they were coming. Then, it hit him. The file. It was gone. The contact was dead, but the file was missing. Whoever had done this was one step ahead of them. And the worst part? The only people who knew about this safe house were Clint, Harris, and the dead man on the floor. There was no more room for error. Clint's mind was moving a mile a minute. Whoever had taken the file was going to use it. Klein's organization wasn't just a few hired guns. They were everywhere. And now, they were one step closer to winning. "We need to find it," Clint said, his voice low, filled with determination. "Before they do." "But where do we even start?" Harris asked, his voice thick with the weight of defeat. "They've got the advantage now." Clint's eyes flickered to the broken window in the corner of the room. It was wide open, the rain pelting the ground outside. "They'll be gone by now," Clint said, scanning the room. "We're out of time." But Clint's voice didn't carry the hopelessness that Harris expected. Clint wasn't done yet. Not even close. "Clint," Harris hesitated, but Clint's eyes were fixed. "We'll find them." Clint's thoughts were now a blur of instinct and strategy. He knew what had to happen next. He reached for his phone and dialed a number that had been out of reach for far too long. The line rang twice before the voice on the other end picked up. "Clint Eastwood," the voice said, familiar yet distant. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Clint replied, his voice cold. "We've got a problem. Klein's on our tail, and he's got the file. I need you to help me take him down. Right now." There was a pause, followed by a sigh on the other end of the line. "You should have called sooner. But all right. I'm in. We do this your way." Clint nodded, but the weight on his chest didn't lift. He knew this was his last shot. If they failed, the consequences wouldn't just be personal, they'd be global. As Clint hung up, he turned to Harris. "Ready for this?" Clint asked, his eyes hard. Harris didn't hesitate. I'm with you to the end. The door slammed behind them as they stepped back into the storm, the night swallowing them whole. They were all in now. No turning back. It looks like we're at the climax of the story now. With Clint and Harris on the brink of their final confrontation with Klein, things are about to get intense. But I see you'd like to continue. And with the previous chapters leading us up to this point, we could imagine what would follow next in a thrilling conclusion. The rain didn't let up as Clint and Harris made their way through the city streets. Every shadow seemed to conceal something far worse than mere darkness. Every distant sound echoed in Clint's ears like a drumbeat of danger, but he remained focused. The file was more than a simple document. It was the key to taking down Klein and stopping his reign of manipulation. Harris kept his head low, constantly checking the rearview mirror. Their brief conversation with their old contact had given them the final lead. But now, they were heading straight into the heart of Klein's operation. The file had to be retrieved. There was no other choice. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out. A text from the mysterious source who'd agreed to help him. The drop-off point is secured. Klein won't expect you. Move fast. Time's up, Clint muttered to himself, handing Harris the phone. We've got one chance to hit Klein before his men close in on us. Let's make it count. They pulled up to the designated location, a run-down warehouse near the waterfront, masked by the low-hanging fog of the city's industrial district. Clint's mind raced with calculations. The warehouse wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a fortress. And at the heart of it, Klein had made his final move. You ready? Clint asked, his voice low, eyes fixed on the entrance. Born ready, Harris replied, giving him a grim smile. They both stepped out of the car, the rain intensifying as if the heavens themselves were conspiring to complicate things. They crouched, moving in sync toward the building. Clint's instincts were on full alert as they crossed the shadowed yard. Every step could be their last. The interior of the warehouse was a far cry from what Clint expected. Rather than a cluttered mess of old crates and machinery, the space was eerily quiet, lit by flickering overhead lights. The hum of machinery was absent, and the silence was unnerving. Clint motioned for Harris to follow as they moved deeper into the maze-like structure. Their boots echoed in the cavernous space as they advanced. Clint could feel the weight of his gun pressing against his side, a constant reminder of the danger. Clint, Harris whispered, you think it's a trap? Clint didn't answer right away. He knew better than to assume anything at this point. Klein was always one step ahead, but they had no other option. They were here. Suddenly, the echo of a door slamming shut rang out behind them. Clint whipped around, gun raised, but there was no one there. Then, a voice. Smooth, calculated, yet dripping with venom. Well, Clint. Didn't think you'd make it this far. Clint's blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. The silhouette that emerged from the shadows was none other than Klein himself, standing tall, a smug smile playing on his lips. Did you think you could hide from me? Klein sneered, his eyes scanning Clint and Harris with mock amusement. You think you're the only ones playing this game? You're too late, Clint. The file is already in my hands. You've walked right into my trap. Clint's grip on the gun tightened, but he didn't fire. Klein was too dangerous to make a rash move. Clint knew better than to let emotions guide his actions now. You're wrong, Clint said, his voice cold, steady. The game's not over until I say it is. Klein chuckled, his hand casually reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a manila folder, the file. Clint's heart skipped a beat, but Klein wasn't finished. He opened the folder slowly, letting the contents spill out in front of Clint and Harris. What you don't realize, Clint, Klein continued, his voice dripping with disdain, is that this file is just the beginning. It's not just about information. It's about control. And now, I control everything. Clint stepped forward, ignoring the weight of Klein's words. His thoughts were racing. There was no time to waste. Klein's arrogance was his biggest weakness. Clint knew the CIA wouldn't sit idly by much longer. You've made a mistake, Klein, Clint said, his voice laced with finality. You think you've won, but you haven't even seen the full picture. Klein raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained. And what would that be, Clint? Your empire is about to fall, Clint said flatly. The CIA is already on its way to dismantle everything you've built. All I had to do was buy time. Klein's smirk faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing. You think I didn't anticipate that? I'm always 10 steps ahead, Clint. You're too late. The file is already in the right hands. Clint's jaw clenched. He knew it. Klein had already set his escape plan in motion, and Clint was merely the last piece of the puzzle. But there was one thing Klein hadn't accounted for, the element of surprise. Before Klein could react, Clint pulled the trigger. The sound of gunfire filled the warehouse, deafening in the stillness. But the bullet wasn't aimed at Klein. It was aimed at the file. The manila folder exploded, scattering papers everywhere. What the hell? Klein shouted, his hands flying to his jacket as if trying to protect whatever was left of his precious file. Clint wasn't done. In one swift motion, he dropped to the ground, rolled behind a stack of crates, and fired again. This time, aiming directly for the control panel behind Klein. The warehouse lights flickered, and the hum of machinery started up. It was the diversion Clint had been waiting for. As Klein cursed and scrambled, Clint's voice cut through the chaos. Your control's slipping, Klein. It's over. You don't get to play God anymore. Klein pulled out his own gun, but Clint was faster. In the dim light, the fight was brutal and fast. Clint had been trained for moments like this. Every move he made was calculated. Klein, on the other hand, was blinded by his arrogance. The final shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse. Clint's gun didn't waver. Klein fell. Clint exhaled deeply, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over. Klein was down, and the CIA had already been contacted. They'd be here soon to clean up the mess. As Clint stood over Klein's lifeless body, he glanced at Harris, who was still catching his breath. We did it, Clint said, more to himself than anyone else. It's done. Harris nodded, though there was a weary sadness in his eyes. Yeah, we did. But at what cost? Clint didn't answer. The weight of the past few days was heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't come out of this unscathed. Neither of them had. But in the end, Clint had always known that there was a price for everything. And as the CIA stormed the building to secure the files and clean up Klein's operation, Clint realized one thing. He had become more than just the man they called the fraud. He was the ghost in the system, the shadow that always moved faster than those who thought they controlled everything. And no one, absolutely no one, could stop him now.